One of the problems we have right now is that we have not had a new medicine approved to treat PTSD in 17 years. Can you believe that? So the only two medications that are on the market with an FDA indication are Zoloft and Paxil. That's it. So all these other medications that we throw at PTSD patients have never actually been formally tested or approved by the FDA. They're just being used off-label. And so that's the sad reality, is that all these PTSD patients are suffering because we're not, pharma companies are not producing any new, innovative drugs. All they're doing is just recycling old drugs and trying to create new patents but here we have this situation where we have all these plants, medically active plants that hold a lot of promise for treating PTSD, and they've been, we've been aware of this for years, but we haven't been able to get the government to allow the research to move forward. And so that's why I was so grateful to see, our cannabis study looking at smoked and vaporized flower is a good start. But like you said, there's so many other medically active plants that could be beneficial for treating PTSD and addictions, and where just the government has systematically impeded this work for so long. And so that's why I'm really proud to be part of, the MAPS team that is spearheading all this really important work on not just MDMA, but they look at the whole breadth of psychedelics. And so they've done work on ayahuasca and ibogaine and all kinds of stuff that could be really important for this. So we have an epidemic of veteran suicide in this country, where we're seeing all this untreated, undertreated PTSD that's been just, torturing patients, including our military veterans, for so many decades. And I'm grateful to be associated with a nonprofit that cares about addressing this and trying to curb this suicide epidemic.
Since it's so humbug trying to get approval to study cannabis, what inspired you to follow that path?
Well, I think, it is kind of atypical. I'm a lifelong Republican that had never used cannabis their whole life till just last year when I got diagnosed with breast cancer. And then I started using to try to prevent recurrence, but I also became very openly, trying to make the public aware that I'm using. Now that I'm a fellow patient, I'm trying to help destigmatize this. I live in Arizona, where it's hard to function if you're not a Republican, but I also stick in there because I feel so strongly that they need to hear from voices like ours that are more moderate. And common sense Republicans are very libertarian, and they understand that we should be defending personal liberty, like the ability to use a natural plant without the government encroaching on that. So I'm just trying to infiltrate those circles, those conservative enclaves, and the only way to do that is by being in the party, being active, and being able to have conversations with them privately that help them rethink some of their antiquated ideas and help them reconnect with their libertarian ideology. So that's why I stay in there. But the party is a massive, disappointment.
Before you used cannabis yourself, did you have an implicit bias against it like most docs?
No, I was never against it, but I was always taught in medical school that this is a dangerous, addictive drug that should be avoided. So anytime I encountered patients in the clinic who would reluctantly admit that they were using it, I would always be very judgmental and really dismissive of all their claims. And I was one of them. And then finally, this mountain of anecdotal evidence started to get my attention, where I just couldn't ignore not just the patients, but all the collateral history from family members. I started losing patients in the clinic to suicide, and then I really woke up to the fact that, God, we're just keep pummeling these people with all these pharmaceuticals, and they're not helping, and then they're actually really toxic, and they're starting. I was starting to realize that. That big pharma, just the domination of that we had been, and I realized what an abomination it is that the medical schools still don't teach anything about the endocannabinoid system. And the problem is, if you're not exposed to that material during training, it's unlikely you'll embrace it later, because you're just juggling so many other things. Like, I'm an internal medicine doctor, so I'm constantly reading medical journals, trying to stay up on a really broad list of conditions, and so the chance of me taking the initiative to learn about cannabis separate from all is really would be unusual. That's what's so discouraging, that the medical schools are failing to teach the most important physiologic mechanism in every human body. It's just a complete void in our curriculum, and so I think when that changes someday, we'll finally start to see doctors embracing cannabis as a medicine. But because they're not even learning the basics about the ECS, it's, the science being trumped by politics once again, where the word cannabis is just so radioactive, and these universities are running scared from even federally legal research. That's what we were trying to talk about in our session, the fact that even studies with FDA approval that have a DEA Schedule 1 license, that are funded with government money, are still, the public universities are somehow fearful that their federal grants are going to be harmed by this work, and so they refuse to do it. And so that's why it was so important to me to find a path that didn't involve universities or hospitals that are so fearful of this, and instead just create, blaze our own trail in the privates. Yeah.
You said in your talk that it takes many years to reschedule a drug. So drugs like cannabis or MDMA couldn't just be with a stroke of a pen,
with the
taken off.
Order. I mean, we've never seen that happen. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I always say, the FDA has to approve all changes to drug scheduling in the Controlled Substances Act. So they would not approve FDA will not approve rescheduling anything without randomized controlled trials. So that's what Epidiolex went through, and unfortunately, Epidiolex is $30,000 to $60,000 a year. That's why we're so determined to study the natural flower, because we believe that not only is that where the real efficacy lies, but that's also the cheapest version. Like every time you do extractions and have to manufacture, it adds a lot of expense. So if flower is the cheapest option, it's the most efficacious, and it sets the most precedence for other botanical medicine. Even though it's all flower is very controversial. You see states are still banning flower. There's some states only pass oil only programs, but we're gradually, once they start like in Pennsylvania, for instance, we spent months working with the health department there to persuade them that oil-only programs were not sensible, were not good for patients, and eventually they changed it, and they just approved natural flower to be on the market a few months ago. And so I was so grateful to see, reasonable scientists in the health department who are looking at data instead of just basing all the decisions on hysteria, emotion, that they're actually willing to see that, this has legitimate science to back it. And it was a really good choice. Pennsylvania's program has expanded tremendously because, if you're going to persuade people to come off the illicit market, you definitely have to have natural flower, good flower too, not just GMP. That's one of the things that I was going to mention, though, is that, I think GMP, forcing flower into this GMP paradigm that Big Pharma has created, is really ruined flower. You can see what we have to buy from the federal government. And if Dr. El Soli at University of Mississippi could just sell the flower as is and acknowledge it, yes, there will be variations from batch to batch, but there are variations now. And what he said, even with the GMP, there's still variations. So I just think that, I just got back from Aruba and Jamaica and all these different who are growing the most gorgeous flower, but they're not allowed to use that for research. And I'm trying to persuade the governments there to allow that to be the study drug that we use, because it would be much more real world, study, more naturalistic if we could use the flower unadulterated, not ground up with all the,
So what I'm hearing from you about what we can do to help move the ball forward is talk to our doctors and tell all of our friends our experience with cannabis or other psychedelics.
Yeah, I think it's important, even if they are taken aback and they look very, side eye at you and stuff. And right, so you gotta. Eventually, you will wear them down. It's just a matter of, initially they'll be shocked and they'll be, and they may even, again, be very judgmental initially, but slowly, we're starting to see even psychedelics now becoming not just mainstream in the public, but even in the universities now where they're studying it actively. We gotta just have all these folks coming out of the shadows and speaking openly, and keep focusing on changing laws, because it's really, the battle is still very important in all these states where there's CBD only and not full spectrum cannabis, and just, we have a ton of work left to do. And
onward.
Yeah, let's
onward.
do it.
Thank you so much for everything you do. Really, thank you.
Thank you guys
awesome.
for your work.
Awesome.
Yeah.